My poem is Dead Man's Dump by Isaac Rosenberg on page 133. Here's some information about the poet. Isaac Rosenberg was Jewish and joined the army in October in 1915, hated the idea of killing, and was an accomplished artist and poet before the war. He was only 20 when he was killed in a German raid on April 1st, 1918, and his body wasn't immediately recovered, but they found the remains of 11 soldiers and they knew that he was one of them. It was impossible to tell who was who, so they are all buried together, and his headstone reads, "Buried near this spot." Dead Man's Dump was written while Rosenberg was in the trenches. Here's the poem. Dead Man's Dump by Isaac Rosenberg. The plunging limbers over the shattered track, racketed with their rusty fright, stuck out like many crowns of thorns, and the rusty stakes like sceptres old, to stay the flood of brutish men upon our brothers dear. The wheels lurched over sprawled dead, but pained them not, though their bones crunched, their shut mouths made no moan. They lie there, huddled, friend and foeman, man born of man and born of woman, and shells go crying over them from night till night and now. Earth has waited for them, all the time of their growth, fretting for their decay. Now she has them at last, in the strength of their strength, suspended, stopped and held. What fierce imaginings their dark souls lit! Earth, have they gone into you? Somewhere they must have gone, and flung on your hard back is their soul's sack, emptied of God-ancestral essences. Who hurled them out? Who hurled? No one saw their spirit's shadow shake the grass, or stood aside for the half-used life to pass out of those doomed nostrils and the doomed mouth, when the swift iron burning bee drained the wild honey of their youth. What of us who, flung on the shrieking pyre, walk, our usual thoughts untouched, our lucky limbs as on ichor fed, immortal seeming ever? Perhaps when the flames beat loud on us, a fear may choke in our veins, and the startled blood may stop. The air is loud with death, the dark air spurts with fire, the explosions ceaseless are. Timelessly now, some minutes passed, those dead strode time with vigorous life, till the shrapnel called an end, but not to all. In bleeding pangs some born on stretchers dreamed of home, dear things war blotted from their hearts. A man's brains splattered on a stretcher-bearer's face, his shook shoulders slipped their load, but when they bent to look again, the drowning soul was sunk too deep for human tenderness. They left this dead with the older dead, stretched at the crossroads. Burnt black by strange decay, their sinister faces lie, the lid over each eye. The grass and coloured clay more motion have than they, joined to the great sunk silences. Here is one not long dead. His dark hearing caught our far wheels, and the choked soul stretched weak hands to reach the living world the far wheels said. The blood-dazed intelligence beating for light, crying through the suspense of the far torturing wheels, swift for the end to break, or the wheels to break, cried as the tide of the world broke over his sight. Will they come? Will they ever come? Even as the mixed hoofs of the mules, the quivering bellied mules, and the rushing wheels all mixed with his tortured upturned sight. So we crashed round the bend, we heard his weak scream, we heard his very last sound, and our wheels grazed his dead face. The poem is long and a bit confusing, but it's from the point of view of a soldier driving a truck over the battlefield, or somewhere near to the battlefield, to pick up the survivors. On the way, the soldier sees a lot of corpses which have just been left there to rot, hence the name Dead Man's Dump, and describes some of the horrors until they hear a man call for them, and they race over to him, but only get there in time to hear his dying scream. This is the first stanza. So the road's really horrible because of all the shell potholes, although shattered is a more dramatic word, and the truck is loaded with rusty freight, which is actually just cargo, but the word rusty shows the poet's opinion that the British artillery is old and not particularly good, while the word freight is a homophone. Homophones have the same pronunciation but different spellings and meanings, so this word could also begin to give this poem a sense of fear and foreboding. There's some obvious Christian imagery, of the crowns of thorns, which implies that the truck is the savior of the soldiers. This is in direct contrast to a lot of other poems that give a sense that there's no hope and no savior. For example, Rendezvous by Alan Seeger, where the soldier accepts he's going to meet with death at war. In the next lines, Rosenberg takes on the typical attitude of the time, where the Germans are brutes and all the other soldiers are brothers, indicating that they have the same mother, who is presumably England, so you can compare this poem to any poem in the section Happy is England Now. However, we know from the next stanzas that he's only doing this ironically. The truck has to drive over dead bodies to get to the living ones, and both sides lie together, huddled, as if for comfort, and Rosenberg acknowledges that even though they fought from different sides, they all had families and were human, a rare kind of empathy that not many poets had, although Sassoon mentions something similar in his poem Glory of Women, which is wider reading. This stanza describes the personified earth as not just reclaiming her children, but as being quite bloodthirsty about it, using the exclamation mark to show an excitement at finally getting what she wanted. This depiction of Earth as bloodthirsty and desperately wanting strength back from her children is opposite of all the typical ideas of Mother England, and in direct contrast with the poem Happy is England Now by John Freeman, which claims that England watches her soldiers fight with pride and tears, and not with a fretting for their death. In this stanza, Rosenberg questions what happens to people when they die, asking the earth if souls go into her, because they must have gone somewhere if they've left their souls' containers behind. He also says that the souls come from God, but questions who took them out, whether it was the Germans, the bloodthirsty earth, which may be a metaphor for how bloodthirsty human nature is, or God himself. No one saw where the souls went, so Rosenberg will never get an answer to his question. Also, the swift iron burning bee could be a metaphor for bullets, which drained the blood, or wild honey, from the soldiers. This also shows that the men died young, which he says in a lot of other poems, including This Generation by Osbert Drain. This poem also uses the idea that the youth were doomed, just like in Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen, which blatantly states that the youth were doomed from its title alone. Alternately, Rupert Brooke's poem Peace thanks God for giving his generation the opportunity to fight, giving the impression that he thought that they were blessed rather than doomed. So before I get to the next bit, Icar is from Greek mythology and it's the blood of the gods. Rosenberg compares living in the war to living on a funeral pyre, wood that people are burned in once they've died. This gives us an image of being surrounded by the dead, the screaming nearly dead and by fire, but surviving due to some divine circumstances, i.e. being fed on the blood of the gods. At first, Rosenberg describes the soldiers in the truck as lucky because they aren't dead, but then makes reference to the fact that in reality they could die at any time, which removes their feelings of invincibility. Also, all of Rosenberg's descriptions of the battlefield match descriptions of hell as Christians would perceive it, with dead bodies everywhere, fire and ceaseless explosions. Then he goes on to relive how the scenes around him went from normality to hell, giving the shrapnel the same barbaric nature that he previously gave to Earth, the exclamation mark once again showing a sense of excitement, and then returns his train of thought to the task he is supposed to carry out, which is to find the wounded that were still alive. Some of these men are dreaming of home, which we can relate to Birdsong, where Stephen calls for his mother before he dies, Jack thinks of his son non-stop before he dies, and when Stephen tries to console Douglas, who has been hit by a shell, he tells him to think of his wife. Only imminent death can block out all thoughts of the war, which Rosenberg knows, and which is the reason he pities them, calling them dear things. Stretcher-bearer realizes that the man he is carrying is dead, but doesn't have the capacity to feel anything amongst all the death. He then throws the new corpse with the old corpses, effectively removing its identity and humanity. This raises the idea of insensibility, which can be linked to Journey's End. It can also be linked to Pat Barker's book Life Class, where the main character stops seeing the faces of the patients after a while. Also, the descriptions are very graphic. The word splattered is really effective because it's onomatopoeic, which just makes it more gruesome to read. Additionally, putting all the corpses together without a second thought could be linked to Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth, in which he is outraged by the fact that the soldiers never got their proper burials or any real respect once they were dead. When bodies rot, they go black, but these bodies have been turned black by burns from shellfire rather than decay, and this makes their death look unnatural and therefore sinister. The next two lines show nature's indifference towards war, as the grass and clay move more than the corpses, as they are still filled with life. This is mirrored by the rhyming couplets in the stanza, which don't correspond to any other place in the poem, and therefore generate a sense of separatedness from the rest of the poem. In this penultimate stanza, the men on the truck notice someone who they think has only just died, but he hears them and calls for them. Rosenberg refers to the man's soul as choked because it's leaving his body, but it could be because it's being forcefully dragged out by some unknown force. The truck represents the living word and the light to the dying soldier, reinforcing the image that they are the saviors, as the living word and the light of the world is what Jesus is supposed to be for Christians. But the dying man is just waiting for anything to happen, whether it's the end of his life or the truck to get there first. This is shown by the repetition of the word break, which implies some impatience due to the amount of torture the soldier is going through. This feeling of desperation is repeated in the doubling of the words mules and the question, will they come? And in the final stanza, the truck rushes to the man, but they are there a moment too late, and their wheels touch his face, just as they've driven over the faces of many other dead men.